Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this third panel at the conference on China in the Global South. My name is Johanna, and I'm really excited to be moderating this panel. So far today, we have been hearing about China's geostrategic aims, as well as the really interesting discussion earlier on development and finance. And we're now going to focus on the impact of China's engagement in the Global South on those countries' governance and rights. I think the question here is not if there's an impact. I mean, we know that there is. So what we really want to dig into today is how those impacts are manifest, their consequences, and I think also get into the role that different stakeholders can play to raise awareness about or to counter those impacts. And what can be done to ensure that democratic institutions and human rights are protected. So to do this, we have a really incredible panel, expert panel. So please allow me to briefly introduce them. I will say I am doing very much a non-exhaustive summary of their achievements and affiliations. So please check out their full bios. So starting immediately on my left in the room, we have Victoria Tin-bor, who is an associate professor at the University of Notre Dame. Her research focused on the impact of war on the historical evolution of China, challenging conventional perspectives by asserting that fundamental citizenship rights emerged in China before they did in Europe, which I thought was really interesting. She also studies and teaches on global struggles for freedom, with a particular focus on her native and my native, Hong Kong. Going to the left, Bulelani Jili, who is a non-resident fellow at the Global China Hub of the Atlantic Council, as well as a non-resident fellow at the Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative, and a PhD student at Harvard. His research focuses on China's export of surveillance technology in Africa and covers Africa-China relations, Chinese geopolitical expansion, cybersecurity, ICT development, internet policy, and privacy law. And then here to my right, we have Chris Walker, who is the Vice President for Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy, where he oversees the NED's portfolio on analytical work. He has really been at the forefront of discussion on authoritarian influence on democratic systems, and I believe helped to coin the term sharp power to describe how authoritarian states tries to manipulate the political environments of other countries. And then finally, joining us virtually is Rana Inboden, who is the Senior Fellow at the Robert Strauss Center for International Law and Security at the University of Texas at Austin. Rana also serves as a consultant on a number of democracy and governance projects in Asia for NGOs and conducts research related to international human rights, Chinese foreign policy, the effect of human rights and democracy projects, and authoritarian collaboration in the UN. So obviously, a great panel with some great expertise on this topic. So for this panel, we're going to have, I'd say, about 40 minutes of moderated discussions, and then have time for questions from the audience. As in previous panels, if you do have questions, please submit them via askac.org. All right, so to kick off, just as by way of introduction, I come to this topic through the lens of my organization, IRI, that focuses on how to support democratic institutions and governance around the world, right? And so our research, on authoritarian influence, I think has produced some pretty robust evidence of how China influences other countries' politics, and obviously our particular interest is on the impact on democratic institutions and practices. Now, based on that research and our field presence, there's some sort of top-line observations that I thought I'd share because I think they're relevant to today's discussion. So there's three I wanted to share. First, I think we've observed that economic ties are really the entry point for Chinese influence, and that those economic ties translate into other kinds of influence. Secondly, that China has moved very strongly to shape global opinion about itself. And has put a lot of resources into that effort by, pushing out sort of pro-China narratives as well as pushing out pro-China censorship. And then the third observation, this top line, is really that, what we see of how China's growing presence in developing countries in the Global South has really been fueling corruption among political elites in those countries. So with that, would like to now turn to our experts for a few rounds of questions. And so this first round is really for some scene setting from our panelists. And Rana, I'd like to start with you. We heard earlier about sort of China, how China sees the Global South, how the Global South fits into China's sort of geostrategic strategy. So specifically for you, how do you see the Global South? How does that fit into China's strategy in multilateral systems, like the UN human rights system, for example?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry I can't join you in person, especially with such a fabulous panel. I'm great admirers of the other panelists. I would say that China has been playing a long game for decades and has courted and cultivated relationships with the Global South. China not only lavishes diplomatic attention on those countries, but has championed issues in the Human Rights Council that it knows will resonate well with the Global South, such as it has taken up the issue of a right to development, and it has sponsored resolutions in the Human Rights Council, including one called the Contribution of Development to the Enjoyment of Human Rights. China has also worked with a very particular swath of Global South countries called the Like-Minded Group. And this group coalesced around resisting robust human rights scrutiny, and they cooperate to shield each other from human rights tension, such as making positive statements for each other when they are facing Human Rights Council attention. And they have also voted for each other to shield each other from resolutions and efforts like that to spotlight human rights abuses. Since 2017, China has started to try to shape and influence the human rights regime much more conservatively. And the Global South countries have been key to China's ability to win enough votes to support some of China's resolutions. China's decades-long efforts in courting the developing South has also been paying dividends more recently with regard to the 2022 resolution that was introduced on Xinjiang. The PRC was able to marshal enough votes to prevail. But I do have a caveat about that voting. So the vote was very close. It was 17 yeses, 11 abstentions, and 19 noes. And China lobbied very, very extensively and aggressively to defeat that resolution. While the sponsors of that resolution, let's just say that their lobbying was not as vigorous and robust. So I think it's very telling that the vote was that close. And I should also flag that the Marshall Islands, Somalia, Honduras, and Paraguay did vote for that resolution. China also uses its statements in the Human Rights Council to garner developing world support. So, for example, when it objected to the Xinjiang resolution, it claimed that today China is targeted, tomorrow it could be another developing country, and that all country-specific resolutions are targeted at developing countries. I'll also say that aside from using its relationships with the Global South to protect itself from scrutiny, China is also using its participation in the human rights system to sow further North-South divisions. It does this through specific initiatives as well as rhetoric. And so, for example, it supported a resolution on, quote, the negative impact of the legacies of colonialism on the enjoyment of human rights. It also frames the right to development discussions around the Global North being obligated to provide aid to the Global South and does not acknowledge the existing generous development aid that has been provided. And so in sum, I would say that the Global South is central to China's goal in shielding itself from human rights scrutiny and also in shaping the UN human rights system. And it's a very instrumental use of the Global South.
Thanks so much, Rana. I mean, those observations, it's consistent, I think, with some of what the earlier speakers were talking about how China sort of casts itself as part of, leader of the Global South, to sort of say what's happening to us is you know, you're next. But, you know, I want to turn to Chris because, you know, we know that China is active in the Global South through a number of different channels. And so, you know, I think we want to kind of dive right in with the question of, is China undermining democracy in these countries? You know, is that happening? If it is, how is it happening? And is it being done intentionally?
So thanks for the question, Johanna. I think the framing of this panel focused on governance and rights is so valuable because the principal frame through which China's engagement has been looked at over the years has been economics and commerce, which is okay to a point, but if it's done exclusively to the exclusion of governance and rights and all the values that fall under those, then it's inadequate. And I think what we've seen over time with great research done by many of the people in this room, so many other colleagues at IRI who've done fantastic work on these topics, is that the sorts of processes and engagement that China state entities, nominally autonomous private entities use come themselves with secrecy, opacity, and corruption. And so you have this effect at scale of non-transparent, opaque forms of engagement, not just in the developing world, but I would contend everywhere to the extent local societies are unprepared and not willing to resist or repel that sort of engagement. And so, for example, in countries as diverse as Bolivia, in the energy and mining sectors, in Ecuador, where the ECU 9/11 security and safety tech platform was put in place, and very notably in the south of Argentina, where a satellite tracking system was put in place in that country, all had the shared features of not having meaningful public discussion in advance of the adoption of these very significant initiatives. Standard gauge railroad in Kenya is another example where not only has the discussion, at least as I understand it, not been sufficiently fulsome and exhaustive, that even at this point when civil society activists ask for parts of the agreement, the local officials will invoke confidentiality and deny access to these documents. And this is a really important point. Groups like Aid Data have done phenomenal work on this. Others are starting to dig into it, that we're now seeing the use and application of confidentiality clauses and other secrecy instruments as just a matter of doing business when China and its entities do work, which has the effect of, I would argue, shifting the norms in the engagement with local governors in the developing world, but then also, in a sense, cutting off the society from a discussion of these projects. Final observation. So I've just alluded to a number of cases that are fairly high profile. I'd also mention work that my colleagues at the International Forum for Democratic Studies undertook on the Huawei-supported safe cities in Mauritius, as well as a Huawei engagement in Serbia, putting tens of thousands of cameras across the country. Similarly, with very few meaningful opportunities for civic engagement. And I would contend that part of the ambition here is to actually sideline civil society, independent media, the legislatures. This, I think it's worth noting, is actually the way that the Chinese state does business at home. They don't welcome any alternative voices, any media, any civic participation in decision-making. And as I say, to the extent this is possible where they engage beyond their borders, they will push the limits to keep things as opaque and secret as possible. But the last point I want to make on this is, I've just alluded to a number of cases that were brought into the public domain, fairly high profile. But in a way, the multitude of actions that the Chinese party state is undertaking around the world often doesn't get that much scrutiny. And so it's kind of humming across dozens and dozens of countries seeking to suppress openness and transparency, to limit the voices that participate in decision-making. And in the end, I think what we need to be striving for is the agency and empowerment of local voices to be able to more meaningfully understand the risks and rewards of engagement with China.
And which is something I think we'll come back to later. But I'm curious, given what you were saying about the sort of the opacity, right, of the approach that Chinese entities are taking. In the cases that you mentioned, are these places where in any other situation, any other kinds of investment, any other large development projects, there was more openness. So I guess the question is, are there situations where there isn't a lot of public engagement anyway, and so that's par for the course? Or is the specific involvement of Chinese entities changing the nature of how?
It's a terrific question. I think just answering at a very basic level, if China and its surrogates are operating in more politically authoritarian settings, which themselves don't have open media, independent civil society, political opposition, they're actually pushing on an open door and welcomed by the authoritarian governors in any number of settings where that would be relevant, both in Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. I'm most worried about the middle performing countries, the swing states that are open and in a sense are in play, because as you're suggesting, Johanna, what we're seeing is kind of nudges and incentives that are at odds with open, transparent government, political participation, and wider participation by societies in these instances. And I think progressively over time, again with the research, good investigative journalism, we see more of the corrosive effects of this kind of engagement, which has the effect of nudging these systems in a way that's less friendly to democratic accountability and human rights.
Yeah, thank you. So Victoria, I want to turn to you. I mean, given Rana's description of how China sees the global South, right, as part of its overall strategy in multilateral settings, and then what Chris has just been talking about sort of the effect of Chinese activities in the global South. I kind of want you to turn to you to both expand on and maybe combine these topics a bit. When you're sort of looking from the global South, I know you've been doing a lot of research in this. What are some of the attitudes, within the global South on Chinese actions, both what China does at home as well as its actions in other countries?
Yeah, this is very interesting because this morning we heard a lot about essentially that we should not really see African countries as just like supplicants to China's demands, China's wishes, and that traps and all of that. What is interesting is that I see a lot of contradictions. So on the one hand, that people want to regain agency from the Western-dominated world, but on the other hand, that China does not give agency to its own people, its own minorities, and the people around. So on the one hand, it's like, they talk about quote and unquote democratization of the international order, but then they don't really promote democracy. They do not allow democracy. And at the same time, they also really stifle civil society at home. And then, and it is just interesting how the anti-Chinese, anti-American sentiment is like, in a way, really colors how we see China's influences in the world. And this morning, I think Tin-bor mentioned that, there's a blind spot, and I think that blind spot is literally everywhere. And then going back to what Rana said about the UN Council. So recently that there's this universal periodic review of China. So what China has been doing is not just to lobby other governments to vote against anything it doesn't like, but also that when it comes to civil society submissions, from out of Hong Kong, no one dares to submit anything. So it's really all the overseas Hong Kong organizations or IRI or Amnesty International, Freedom House, that basically could put in submissions criticizing the national security law crackdown and the proposed Article 23 even further crackdown. What they've done is to swarm the whole mechanism with their own kind of like Gongo governments, essentially government-sponsored NGOs, with their own submissions to swarm the picture. Oh, it's half and half. The situation's not that bad. Look at the civil society. If half of the people don't like you, half the people like you. This is like you're doing okay. But this is like, it's, do those voices represent the civil society? This goes to what I was talking about earlier, that they talk about democratization of the international order, but they really kill democratization. And then also that in the Hong Kong-based law, now I want to talk about Hong Kong in a way that, so Hong Kong was promised one country, two systems, just as, at the same time that there are all of these promises. But Hong Kong people like to say that Hong Kong is the new Berlin. If Beijing can manage to kill the freedom, the transparency, the responsible government that once existed and thrived and institutionalized in Hong Kong, what does it tell us when it comes to much other less free and less institutionalized countries around the world in the global south? So the basic law, Article 39, promises that Hong Kong should continue to be a signatory to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and various labor conventions. So whenever there are these reviews, again, they also overwhelm all of these civil society submissions. And in this situation, then, it's like, the narrative is so hard to really fight back. So I know that we're going to have another a panel on that. So maybe I stop here.
Okay, all right, that's helpful. Thank you for that. So Bulelani, just turning to you, there's been quite a bit of discussion today about the control of the information space overall. And I really wanted to draw you out on how this has been playing out in Africa specifically. I mean, we know China has been quite systematically increasing its engagement across the African continent for the last couple of decades through a number of different channels. How, from your perspective, how is China shaping the information environment in Africa? And what is the impact of that on governance and rights, across the continent? Just generalizing across the continent.
General across the continent. Well, firstly, I'd like to say thank you for your time and consideration today, and I'm also very happy to kind of be with this panel. So before I kind of speak to the specific point in terms of thinking a bit about China's influence over cyberspace, I think it's partly important to somewhat historically contextualize its general involvement within building out the very infrastructure that allows the internet to be possible within Africa. If you kind of rewind back to about 1998, that's when you see a tremendous growing demand for infrastructure building, specifically kind of cyber capability in Africa. That's in part because within the 90s, you see a growing decline of manufacturing capability to produce the necessary GDP output for African countries like Kenya, like South Africa. And so the internet, and specifically the industries and markets that the internet produces, was thought to be one of the primary vehicles in order to support this kind of new emerging interest and market. One of the main players in order to provide that kind of infrastructure was Huawei. When Huawei comes into Kenya in the context of 1998, it originally really comes in with about 10 people. And their main interest at the time was really to kind of get into lucrative tender contracts. Obviously at the time, in 1998, the kind of ICT environment of Kenya was somewhat dominated by mostly really Western companies. How Huawei was able to kind of beat out these initial kind of traditional partners of the Kenyan government was partly because the risk was distributed really between Huawei and the government. So effectively, the government was allowed Huawei to sell its products almost at half the price of the original kind of cost of the initial products at the time. And then if you kind of fast forward to about, say, 2013, 2014, is when you start seeing things like safe city products being a general commodity that's being sold by companies like Huawei. That initial product seems relatively harmful when you think about the leveraging of ICT infrastructure to produce efficiency outcomes for an urban environment like Kenya. The more malicious part of it is that you're introducing facial recognition capabilities without appropriate checks and balances. Appropriate checks and balances simply would look like effectively thinking a bit about more robust data governance models or privacy regimes that will ensure that biometrical data is not being misused or people are not effectively being identified unnecessarily by the police. China does not particularly promote that. Another kind of interesting part of it is that then China does not only effectively not speak to some of the challenges that go about using some of these technologies, it then actively trains the police in its own tactics surrounding effectively the leveraging of facial recognition systems within these kind of given countries. And so suddenly you're seeing also the normative exploitation of certain methods around the technology and policing. Now, of course, if you kind of take a step back and then you look into, say, the data governance regimes of, say, Kenya or South Africa or Nigeria, on the books, it looks a lot like effectively what scholars have been calling the Brussels effect. Effectively, one of the main proponents of data governance and privacy in the world is Europe, and they've been quite active in promoting a relatively kind of human rights-centered approach to governance. However, what is on the books is not actually what's being conducted by the police, in part because there's a huge gap between effectively the idea surrounding privacy and its implementation on the continent. And what the police are practicing looks quite different from what's being effectively promoted by civil society in the context of, say, Kenya and in the context of, say, Nigeria. And so in many ways, then, it's both about gaps, but it's also really about thinking actively about China's normative exploitation commitments, and not simply, exporting, but then also then trying to legitimate it. And so one other part of it is what, they've been kind of calling cyber sovereignty, which effectively suggests that the state should be the primary instrument to dictate what happens within your own given cyber environment. That means effectively that if the government here says the internet should be closed, the internet should be closed, and other parties shouldn't have the same level of say about how you should dictate the internet space. That in itself is effectively offered, coverage for more authoritarian-like thinking as relates to the maintenance of the internet, while simultaneously it presents itself as a general commitment to meeting African stakeholders where they are, i.e. we are democratic in terms of accepting all kinds of political expressions, including ones that may not necessarily accept human rights as the primary basis of political organization.
So you talked about sort of the gaps that exist between sort of what the law says, that this question of no safeguards being in place, and that civil society groups having a different understanding on sort of the meaning of privacy, for example. So I want to press you a little bit on that. For the civil society groups in Kenya who do have a different understanding and want to assert that, want to advocate for that, what has that experience been like for those groups who might be trying to push back on that?
Sure. I think one kind of a very important, and so I will try and kind of ground it in kind of context. So let's use 2014 as an example. So in 2014, effectively what happens is let's rewind. In fact, let's go to 2013. In 2013, Kenya suffered one of its kind of worst terrorist attacks in the kind of the Westgate Mall massacre, where effectively about 69 civilians were killed. Within that particular episode, the government thought that one of the main challenges surrounding that terrorist attack was simply about policing inefficiencies that resulted in their inability to adequately respond. And so the government then wanted to build out effectively a surveillance capability system that would, at one level, help them to identify the criminals, but also effectively increase their response time. So who are you going to go to in the context of Kenya at the time? You're going to go to Huawei. Huawei immediately comes and says, don't worry, we are going to provide you all the facial recognition capabilities that you need, and you don't even necessarily have to ask us questions. So how are you going to push this bill, or at least this ideational and then technical instrument ahead? They immediately start putting up a bill called the security law, which effectively says the government can use the surveillance system in any way they want as long as it's for national security interests and purposes. That kind of arrangement has made it quite difficult then to actually track the misuse of the surveillance system. And so for civil society, who is actually interested in curbing the misuse of these systems, they're consistently battling, one, with a current policy arrangement that is not particularly transparent, but also a kind of technical partner that is very much fine with working with non-transparent parties. And then also a party that is willing to bankroll the further expansion of a surveillance system that is profoundly fine with kind of misusing the surveillance system, regardless of what civil society chooses to say and think.
Yeah, please go.
If I want to add, may add to that is that what has been perfected in Xinjiang is something called predictive policing. So they arrest you before you've committed anything. They just look at the profiles. If you pray 5 times a day, you read the Quran, you grow a beard, that means that you are likely to be a terrorist. And so therefore, this is why so many people were put into concentration camps. And they are doing similar things in Hong Kong now, is that essentially everything is about national security. Everything relates to national secrets. Now, national secrets cover not just foreign affairs, military affairs, but also socio-economic data. And this very, very expensive definition of anything falls under national security has been exported to the rest of the world. And I think earlier, Wang also talked about how even Bretton Woods institutions have been basically switching closer and closer to China's practices. So this is essentially the kind of trends that we're seeing.
So this is actually kind of a perfect segue into the next round of questions, which is sort of a question I want to ask to all of you, which is on this export of technology, the tools for surveillance and censorship that you've both touched on. So China's providing these tools, right, to governments, to fragile democracies. What are you seeing? How is this export of these tools affecting? Is it bolstering authoritarian trends? How are you seeing this play out? Chris, I'm going to kick this over to you first.
So I think at some level the patterns are not so heartening. I think determining with precision how much the technology is reshaping things is hard to say. And in a way, I'm more concerned about some of the issues we've already discussed in this session relating to both the process and the methods of the adoption of the tech, which themselves can be secret and non-transparent, which is problematic. I mean, one of the things that's becoming clear in many settings around the world is that technologies that are marketed as ostensibly bringing more security and safety don't in fact necessarily do that, but what they do is enable the authorities to surveil their population with greater ease in many respects. And that's where this idea of knowledge, awareness, meaningful public discussion is so important, because optimally what you want is, in any setting, irrespective of where it is on the planet, you want a society to be able to really have sufficient information to say, this is okay with me. Like, I understand there are risks involved. I understand that the purveyor of the technology may bring some corrupt practices with them, but I believe the benefits outweigh those risks. My strong sense, having looked at a lot of examples, and my colleagues have done a good deal of research on there, is that that level of awareness and the level of discussion is profoundly inadequate. And so the adoption of this technology is happening, I don't want to say in the dark, but it's at a minimum in the haze. And that's not a good thing for democratic prospects, and it's certainly not a good thing for the citizens living in these societies. And just one other observation on this: the people in positions of power are always looking for ways to find an edge and to push the boundaries. In middle-performing countries where there's a lot of tension between whether it's going to be more closed and autocratic or maybe a little more open and democratic, these technological tools, I would argue, almost by their design and lack of normative boundaries, can really help nudge things in an adverse direction. And so it's something that we all need to be incredibly mindful of, especially in settings where the institutional roots are not so deep.
Thank you. Victoria, you started touching on this in the last round of questions, but just from a perspective of activists, right, who are trying to advocate on various issues. Can you talk about the impact of this export of the surveillance technology, and what impact is that having?
Yeah, so when it comes to technology, for example, I've cut off ties with people in Hong Kong. I cannot go back, and people in Hong Kong have to cut off ties with me, because the first thing when the policemen come knock on your door, the first thing they do is to ask for your phone. So people use all of these encrypted apps, but still, if the police actually control your your phone, then what do you do? So all of your contacts basically exposed. And we should also understand surveillance technology, not just in terms of cameras. Now, cameras are very important because, for example, a lot of these scholars of state society relations would say that there's always some room for the society, for civil societal actors to push back, because you cannot put a policeman in every single street corner. The cameras are important because the same dollar can now go so much farther in repressing, in monitoring the population. And not just on the surface, but also now literally underground. No one can actually organize anything without getting into the regime's radar. I think this is why this technology is so scary. And then another thing too is that we should think of this kind of technology also in terms of financial data. So for activists, they need to raise money. They need to, and then what has happened with the Hong Kong diaspora is that a lot of people still inside Hong Kong, they cannot really engage in any activism. People outside, they engage in activism. So one group can do something, but they don't have money. One group of people can't do anything, but could provide financial support. But then now everyone inside Hong Kong is worried that if I support any group, and if the Hong Kong police, for example, ask Google for data, ask bank for data, and they now under Hong Kong's version of national security law, they have to do it if they want to survive. And HSBC has been complicit in following orders to close accounts of activists and NGOs. And these tools basically all enhanced by essentially very, very advanced technologies that have created the same cameras and also surveillance.
Thank you. Rana, I would like you to draw you in here on this question of sort of surveillance and censorship, and really drawing back to the point Victoria made in the first round about how China sort of drowned out alternative voices at the UPR in terms of not really enabling other independent civil society to make submissions. Interested your comments on all of that.
Well, I want to say that I agree with my panelists very much, and I've appreciated their comments. Victoria is absolutely right about China using gongos to drown out civil society voices, but there were other ways that China manipulated the UPR process. It encouraged many of its allies, including authoritarian countries, to sign up for speaking slots. That resulted in so many countries signing up that each country only had 45 seconds to make a statement. And because many of China's friends, and many also from the global south, made very kind of weak or bland statements, that ate up time, and it gave less time for countries that really wanted to ask questions about Hong Kong, about the Uyghur crisis. So China definitely manipulated that process. China also used its gongos in another way that I've heard about, which was that they also physically tried to take up most of the civil society space seating. So China is in many ways trying to drown out both civil society and other governments from being able to express their views and concerns about what's going on throughout China, as well as in some of the other China regions.
So it's interesting then, the nature of censorship. It's not just, I mean, I think we hear a lot about the online, the use of technology for censorship, but the censorship can also be just old school, putting people in seats to prevent others from taking up space, and sort of the management, the manipulation, as you said, Rana, of the system. Bulelani, sort of to close out this round, you started talking earlier about the technology that's being employed across Africa. Can you just speak a little bit more to that, of sort of what kind of impact do you think what we see, what's coming, right? Technological advances. What kind of impact is that going to have on the trends that have been discussed today?
Yeah, sure. So I'll try and structure at least my response by trying to, I guess, speak to some of the remarks about transparency, misuse, and then maybe some of the privacy law-related gap questions. So transparency. So for example, when Kenya was trying to get effectively a range of surveillance systems adopted, they effectively got Safaricom to say they'll be the primary contractor. I don't know if anybody here knows Safaricom, but Safaricom effectively is a telecommunication company that mostly provides either a money transfer platform or simply hardware goods like cell phones. But they were the primary contractor for surveillance tools. The question is where are they getting their surveillance tools from? They're procuring it from Huawei. Huawei selling it through the back door, but while ostensibly to the public it looks like Safaricom is offering the actual technology. And so the public in itself was not made completely aware of the source of the technology in itself. What exactly they were providing was generally a range of goods. The range of goods came from effectively an interest in clouding computing capabilities. It came in the means of both getting analog standard surveillance cameras. It came with an interest in also getting infrared-related cameras. It also came in an interest in getting facial recognition tools. Those tools effectively allowed the state, to be able to identify a person, of course, raising basic rudimentary questions around like the safety and the management of biometrical data by the state, but more importantly, exactly where did the state get this everybody's biometrical data? Effectively, people were asked to, offer their biometrical data, supposedly, for an ID card they actually never got. But, it's kind of a long kind of story about that part. But the point is that effectively it was not particularly very clear how the data is being managed and whether or not it's going to be used for the initial intentional purposes that the people thought that they were signing on for. And then in terms of the misuse of the technologies, what is particularly quite striking about, for example, having a facial recognition system within your given city is that it's not particularly clear whether or not it's actually reducing crime and terror in that context. If you kind of look into some of the data that, the Kenyan police have offered us, is that all the areas that are supported by their facial recognition system do not seem to be reducing crime. In fact, crime has risen in some of the general areas, which of course, I think intuitively kind of makes sense, in part because crime is not simply the absence of surveillance. It's also partly contingent on other social and economical factors that result in the outcomes of crime within a given region. And then as it relates to kind of, I'd say, questions of privacy, if you kind of look quite broadly on the African continent, about half of the African countries have a privacy law in the books. For the countries who don't have privacy in the books, many of my interlocutors consistently tell me that we first need to have the infrastructure before we can talk about privacy regimes. For those who have the infrastructure and who do have privacy, there is a general anxiety about effectively let's say, the application of privacy, in part because they're anxious about what will those privacy demands mean for their emerging startup ecosystems. And so the slow take on privacy, in part, is also an anxiety about how it impacts a startup ecosystem. And then for those who are implementing and who are interested, in ensuring a robust privacy regime in place, many of the time it's really simply about a capacity question. And somebody, who's done extensive work, for example, in the context of Kenya, the data commissioner of Kenya is really about 10 people for the whole country. And so at one level, it's also simply about how do you support people who are trying to do good work. And so, there are multiple kind of challenges in terms of supporting the stakeholders. And those stakeholders will be different in terms of where they necessarily fall in some of these challenges.
Okay, thanks. So I've got one more round of questions for our panelists and then would like to open it up to audience questions. So again, just please submit those through askac.org. So I would really like to sort of start with both Bulelani and Chris, because you've both referenced in the context of China's operations in countries in the global south, sort of the dangers of lack of information, lack of capacity. You sort of talked about making decisions in the haze. And so there's also, as we've heard a lot today, there's just the reality of China being the major trading partner of most of the countries of the Global South. So, I mean, China is present. There is going to be activity, but what can host governments do? What can host governments do to balance their, economic development objectives with the protection of their democratic institutions, with the protection of human rights, protecting environmental sustainability, sort of all of those things? What, when they're dealing with Chinese investors, what are some of the things that they can do? Perhaps we can start with what? You want to kick off?
So maybe I would just tweak the question to say, what can the societies do? So I think part of the challenge we're confronting, and this was alluded to in the last session, the book discussion of Josh Eisenman's book, part of the challenge is that the governments that are engaged with China are not inclined to lean in the direction of greater openness, even in countries that are relatively open. So I think for the purposes of this discussion, it's probably better to set aside the authoritarian to authoritarian relationship. It's a very challenging set of circumstances. But we talk about, in many of the countries in Latin America that are open countries, many of the countries in Africa, in West Africa, for example, Senegal, Ghana, and so forth, some of the countries that have been alluded to during the discussion, there's space there to not assume that economic and commercial progress has to come at the expense of transparency and openness. And we've almost kind of settled into that assumption. And we should try to guard against that and say, the costs that are, essentially the costs that are coming with economic engagement, the non-economic costs in terms of censorship, surveillance, secrecy, corruption. It's almost axiomatic. If you have more secrecy and opacity, you're likely to have more corruption. So if you have this much corruption and you add this much more secrecy and opacity, you're probably going this way with the corruption. Because you want to have more digging, more investigative journalism, more oxygen on the decision-making process. To the extent engagement from China and its surrogates is suppressing openness and transparency, it's bound to then shrink and suppress democratic accountability. I think part of what needs to happen is a cognitive reset about the expectations of engagement commercially with China. But then some very practical things to really supercharge awareness of not only the putative rewards, but the risks of engaging China. And it's really important to say that there are any number of cases where there's a lot of hype about the likely benefits and payoff of engagement economically with China that don't necessarily play out that way. But there's still a lot of elite relationship building in the meantime, which leads me to a second suggestion, which is we need a more forward-leaning approach to elite co-optation or capture. And I wouldn't limit that to any part of the world, because when the Chinese party state engages, they really target the executive branch of governments, and then they look for pieces of the business elite, possibly the media elite, as their pathway to influence and, in their view, control. So I think it's really important to have almost a fresh agenda to get at some of these issues. Part of it is, challenging some of the assumptions we've had about the things you have to give away to have economic advance, which I would not agree with, and then start thinking about some more meaningful ways of communicating, providing more opportunities to guard against the capture of key elites. Once that happens in a given spot, it makes a lot of the other things we're discussing far harder to pursue.
Bulelani, your thoughts on what Chris said and anything else on that?
Yeah, for sure. I think one particular thing that is important to stress is, again, this prejudgment that somehow development comes at the cost of, say, democratical norms is a preposterous claim that is consistently being promoted precisely as a way to offer greater demands for kind of democracy in Africa, in part mostly coming from the people. And so in many ways, to me, it seems as though that one possible through line is really about how do we actively engage more consistently with civil society organizations, but also ensure that all discussions related to, say, in this context, say, data governance, does have a multi-stakeholder approach to it that does include, civil society, the academic class, and the leadership. And to kind of, for example, ground this in an example is, currently, we have the kind of the African Free Trade Agreement coming up. It's going to be the largest kind of trading bloc, and there is no yet clear strategy in terms of how to effectively harmonize data governance across the continent. So that's where we can kind of best leverage the kind of the large market. How exactly is that kind of data governance harmonization strategy going to take place in terms of its inputs on values is going to be important. And ensuring that effectively civil society and other stakeholders who are thinking about kind of inclusion and democracy and a more inclusive economic strategy going forward need to have a kind of a seat in some of those conversations. And so platforming those people, I think, is the most important thing going forward.
Yeah, please.
I want to say that civil society has been, or if they were weak to begin with, they are even more weakened. And Hong Kong once had a very strong civil society. Now no one dares to say anything. So the solution then really has to go back to governments. And I think some of the Hong Kong activists are really kind of like circulating that to push the U.S. Congress to revise the Foreign Corruption Practices Act to include not just literally bribes, but also human rights violations. For example, that Google cannot hand over data. HSBC, if you are going to have any businesses in the U.S. at all, you cannot freeze activists' account. And then if maybe countries in the global south, if they want to really improve governance, then they can also follow this, because you also have their own version of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. A lot of businesses, they claim ESG, so environmental, social governance, but they often greenwash their human rights violations and complicity. They just BlackRock, HSBC, Tesla, they invest in green stuff, but then they look the other way. So if we can have something to compel these investment companies to do something to help, that I guess would give the civil society a little bit of room.
So I think from Chris and Bulelani, you really sort of the effort to try to clear the haze, right, means engaging societies, engaging this multi-stakeholder approach to really try and bring more information into the space. Victoria, I think you're referring specifically to advocacy to governments, not the host governments, but governments like the US government, on how they approach or how they potentially monitor activity of US entities as well. And I think this kind of brings us nicely to this last part, Rana. I'd like to kind of draw you in on this of really what is the role of international stakeholders? Whether it's Western governments, whether it's multinational companies, what role can they play in either enabling or confronting Chinese-led development projects, Chinese-led advocacy in multinational, in multi-state, in multilateral settings, that, when we're talking about violations of rights or environmental standards or the censorship that we were discussing earlier, what kind of role do you think different international stakeholders could play?
Well, certainly, I think that international stakeholders should be playing a robust role in speaking out against that. I also think that the business community has sort of been the weak link on this for decades. I've been working on China long enough that there's been a number of turning points where the business community was, let's say, unhelpful. But I also think that there can be another approach that many of the panelists here have touched on, which is that I would love to see Western actors, international actors, building up the global south to be able to articulate their own concerns about China's involvement in their countries. And I've noticed throughout my research that the amount of expertise within many of these countries on China, including on the kinds of standards that economic investment and development aid should be held to, is very weak. And this includes both academic expertise as well as civil society understanding of China. And so I think one very smart way is to just help invest in those civic groups so that they can be a voice in their own countries.
Victoria, did you want to jump in again on the question of other things that international stakeholders might be able to do?
Yeah, I agree with Rana. I think there is basically general acknowledgement that a lot of countries, I think also this morning, that talk about how China has trained so many African leaders And so, and then they just adopt China's version of the mainstream narrative, and they don't think deeply under. And also, a lot of China experts also kind of think, just think about the U.S. and China, rather that, China itself also denies agency to Taiwan, to Hong Kong, to Uyghurs, to Tibetans. That message somehow basically is this big blind spot.
Mm-hmm. Chris, did you want to, any thoughts on the question of international stakeholders?
So maybe I'll answer it in the following way. I've been struck over the years the extent to which powerful international stakeholders have been willing to trim their sails or not speak candidly about evident issues in front of them. And I think over time that's had the effect of lowering the bar for our understanding on China, the Chinese Communist Party's ambitions, its behaviors, which is precisely what the leadership in Beijing wants. And so in a sense, free societies and independent institutions within open societies have been their own worst enemy in these instances. And that can be changed. Mm-hmm. There's nothing preventing people in most instances from speaking more candidly and openly on these issues. And that's something I think we would all benefit from.
Yeah. And last thought, any additional thoughts to you?
No, I think we've exhausted it.
All right, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Since we managed to incorporate the questions we'd received into that last round of questions, we can come to a close just a tad early. I would like to first thank our panelists for just some excellent, sort of a lot of food for thought, I think. Hopefully will be a good contribution to the next sort of day and a half here. And then my last job is to just ask everyone in the room to please just stay in your seats because they will transition to the next panel after this. But thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.